what we've been talking about a lot is about the suffering of a separate self, the belief that we are separate on the mental level, the suffering of separation. So, when we talk about depression, we're talking in the first place about disconnection. The sense of not being connected. Which feeds a lot of senselessness. And senselessness isn't really a sense, obviously. There's a kind of clue in the word senselessness. But it's not a sense, it's insensitive. Senses are shutting down. When the senses shut down, we get a feeling of senselessness. Which has an effect on our vitality. It's as if we were a nodule in an electric circuit, and the disconnection means that the electricity is not coming to us anymore. We're just a piece of plastic and a wire then. It's like we are a television set and the signal went. There's nothing appearing in terms of input. There's no show. So we're talking about disconnection. When we talk about rejection, which is so much part of the formula of disconnection, we get to more a kind of violence, either a self-violence or a violence towards the other, where there is this pushing down, this depression or repression or refusal to allow what's anyway already here. Which is a kind of loser's game, basically. We can reject and reject and reject, but it just goes around in a kind of illusory circle of horror. It's like, anyway, we are here, all of us. And it's the same thing with depression. There's one sense which doesn't ever get lost, even in the most severe depression. And that's the sense of self. The sense of self. Even if we are totally closed down, as disconnected as possible from the outer world, and from the environment, the sense of self stays. And this can be unfortunate. When people are moving towards suicide, it's sometimes to try and get rid of that. It's still there. Yeah. To get rid of that sense of self. For some people, that level of despair can be the healing moment where they awaken to the sense of self in its purity.
But it's not a comfort to have a sense of self? that you want to be
When the
rid of.
depression is so extreme and the suffering of isolation and separation is just building up and it's already completely out of control, the fact that we are still here as a self is the suffering of the extreme isolation and despair. On the system. The sense of self isn't a suffering, it's just still there. You know, we can sleep and sleep and sleep 18, 19 hours a day, it's still there. We can shut down all the systems, not speak to anybody, it's still there. So it's an interesting and fundamental doorway to allow this sense of self in terms of any kind of truth, any kind of reality, any kind of freedom in form, freedom to be somebody or someone or to be nobody or no one. This sense of self is always there as a fundamental. And it's a sense. What these energetic afflictions like depression and anxiety and the pain of rejection and the programming of our mind does is to separate this sense of self from others. It creates the other. So what this births in a way, it's like there's only one sense of self and everybody else is a doll, is a paper cutout. They are pieces on a chessboard. They don't have a sense of self. I have a sense of self. The others, the cat, they're just kind of figures appearing on the screen of my sense of self. They don't have a sense of self. And it becomes easier and easier to do that when we lessen our sense of self, paradoxically. When we have when we close down or reject this sense of our own self, then it's much easier to relate to others as if they don't have a sense of self themselves. It's much easier to use them, to exploit them, to see them as objects. And the more we have a sense of our own self, the more unintuitive and crazy it begins to appear to treat other people as if they didn't have one too, as if they weren't also with a sense of self. When we begin to make a contact with our own sense of self, which has always been here, and then we contemplate somebody else, or another creature, or just inquire, just check, a tree, does it have a sense of self? Is it the same sense of self? Is it the same self which is being sensed? And we're talking about subtle energies now. So the physical difference in body, size, shape isn't really the point. So we all know that one open cable in an electricity network can kill us if we touch a live wire. It's not the size of the cable or the length of it, it's the charge which is moving through it. So it could be possible, as we're talking about energies, that your physical size, meaning if you're a beetle or a very tall human being doesn't say anything about your sense of self. Doesn't make it less. If you're a cat, you don't have less of a sense of self than if you're a human being. You don't have less of a self and a sense of self if you're a little cat than if you're a human being studying in Harvard. The sense of self, it's totally possible that it's the same self. It's not dependent on the size, shape, because we're talking about energy.
I just thought that animals doesn't have a sense of self, like self-awareness.
So when we talk about a sense of self, are we talking about self-awareness?
We know.
This would depend what we mean about self-awareness.
So can you tell the difference?
So a lot of people who say animals don't have consciousness, don't have self-awareness, and all of this, are using the phrase self-awareness to mean they don't look at themselves as an object. The cat doesn't sit there and say, okay, here I am, the cat, I'm looking cool today, I'm a Gingy, and it doesn't split from itself to create a false self and then contemplate how it's appearing. It's more direct. And humans have this thing called self-awareness, which in this sense is meaning like splitting from and looking at what I am. And this is the search to be somebody. This is the left-hand turn of to be someone, to become someone, and of course it's not good enough and it's dependent on the environment. Is it accepted? Is it rejected? Can I tweak it? I have to improve it, but it's not. There's a total split between this one that's looking in the mirror, the image, and the image. The one that's tweaking and trying to create the self is completely separate from this, God knows what it is, this illusion that it's trying to project. So if animals don't have that, they're probably blessed and more evolved than us, if they don't have that split, that vanity, kind of narcissism. The sense of self, or the awareness of I am, the I amness. Is in no way separate from self. It's a sense of self. It's much more inherent to being. It's part of being. But you don't have to be in being to have a sense of self. You could be in a psychosis in your mind with a million busy thoughts. You could still have a sense of self. It's the I, but not an identity. It's the meanness without the ingredients.
Should I understand that all the way?
Yeah. So, is there anyone here who thinks that they suspects that they don't have a self? This is actually a serious question because there are philosophers who argue there is no self.
Because what?
There are philosophers that argue there is no self. There isn't one. Doesn't exist.
What's the attitude of non-dualism to the self?
That would all depend which strain of non-dualism and which
Okay.
teaching you go down to.
Okay.
And I don't want to put the philosophical contra because then we get into a mind game.
Right.
The question is really moving experientially into if we believe that we don't have a self. This is a very strong materialistic viewpoint. Now I speak a little bit for Avri because he's more in this world. That everything's just a kind of conglomeration of physical matter and neural networks, and some of it we don't understand and some of it we do, but at a certain stage we will understand it enough and we can create a human being from artificial intelligence. So this is based in the belief in a way that there is no self. And yet, one of the first signs that there is a self is there in our belief in a separate self. How could we be so programmed, so hardwired to believe in a separate self without there being a self? We have a self. There is a self here. And we can sense it. We can't do ourselves many favors by jumping the process of reason and going straight into a separate self without first acknowledging that we have a self. We don't, it would seem crazy to take all of that pain and that suffering, that rejection, this depression, this anger, this fear, all of this, without first of all checking the self, the sense of self. We use it all the time in our language, me, myself, and mine. We think we can possess stuff, other people, reality, opinions. So all of this depends on this self, myself. And there can arise a kind of icky feeling of like, this is like intimate and all of this, but that's not the self. That's an icky feeling of like, or almost a kind of niggly old fear of like, to do with having a separate self. Which one is me then? What makes me special? That's not it, that's not the self. That's just stuff in the way of sensing yourself. So in a way we are all our own laboratories, we're all scientists and we are all our own laboratories with this. There's nowhere else to look for this sense of self, except first-hand, direct, be inside yourselves. We can't find it in another person until we find it in ourselves.
Thinking about the words myself and ourselves, you said ourselves, it's our common self.
If we follow it through, so we've got the self and we've got the pain of a separate self. And in the idea of separate self, like self being, myself being divided from yourself, is so much suffering. This we see. There's so much discomfort. And in general, throughout the whole organism, when we suffer, it normally indicates something's not right with this. Something's not in harmony, something's not good here. This is what suffering tends to say. You know, your knee hurts, there's something going on with your knee. It's not in naturalness. But it's very, very important with this not to jump to the abstraction of, yes, we're all one and it's one self and all of this, because then we miss out the sense of self. It's also a sneaky spiritual way to escape through a concept. It's enough to go in and to open our own sense of self and to gradually invite this sense of self to expand without any conditions. And of itself, we will begin to realize the same self in others. But that's more of an effect.